So we will go ahead and get started. I would like to thank everybody today for joining our November installment of our Team Science series. Just for future reference, these are our upcoming spring sessions. We will have a Team Science boot camp in January, followed by diversity and that should say representation in teams, not presentation. Sorry about that. And then it will end with a team leadership and motivation session. So now I will go ahead and turn it over to our speaker for today and let her introduce herself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Maritza Salazar Campo. I'm at UC Irvine. I'm a professor in the Paul Merage School of Business, and I'm also the program director of Team Science for two CTSAs, the UC Irvine CTSA and the UCLA CTSA. I'm also the founding president of the International Network for the Science of Team Science. So I'm going to start, though, by asking each of you a couple of questions, and I don't know if you would mind for a second turning on your camera. And I'm very interested in learning where Team Science fits into your current research or professional goals. And so if, you know, maybe some of you are trying to get your first R01 and teaming means putting together a set of mentors around you, getting your lab really working effectively so your first couple of studies, you know, take off. Perhaps you're mid-career thinking more about collaborating and multiple PI mechanisms. Or maybe you're in a space where you'd like to get your first federally funded center. So if I could ask maybe one or two of you to just share a little bit about where Team Science fits for you and why you're here, maybe something you'd like to learn related to Team Science. Anybody want to volunteer this morning and say hi to your colleagues?
This is Twee. I'll go first.
Sure.
So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I work full-time as an organization development psychologist for the VA healthcare system. So my work really focuses on team development, how to help work groups work well together across different teams, really looking at their sense of psychological safety, cohesion, and helping to continue to build that within that setting, as well as consulting with management, coaching executives to more effectively lead and support their teams. And then I also have a private consulting practice doing executive coaching.
Excellent. So Twee's really thinking more about the system of VA healthcare provision or clinical work being done in the VA. Raise your virtual hand if you are submitting an R01, hopefully within this year. And you can find the virtual hand under reactions. Okay, so no one is submitting an R01. How about another grant where you're being asked to submit a management plan or some other collaborative write-up for how the team is going to work together? No one is submitting a grant that needs Team Science descriptions. Okay, well, we will keep on moving forward then. How many of you are engaged in Team Science at work or teaming at work? Yes, there we go. There we have a couple of hands. All right, so I'm going to start my presentation. I really was just hoping to get a sense of what your particular needs are in your particular role right now. Okay. All right, so like I mentioned, I'm going to talk about facilitating basically better dynamics within teams, and I'm going to share with you a research study that I did and bring to light some best practices along the way. Julie and Steve, do you have a question, or your hand is just up from before? Okay, all right, so my work at UCI and at UCLA started actually before, when I was a doctoral student at the NYU Stern School of Business. And I'd been conducting some work there at the Langone Medical Center, and was really interested in understanding why some multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary research projects fared better than others. The vice chancellor for research at the time was also interested in this question and allowed me to go into these teams and be a silent observer. And just like you all, topics ranged from multiple sclerosis, vascular health, otolaryngologist sort of work around cochlear implants, right? Topics really range in a lot of different clinical domains. And so the interest for me was also, gosh, what works in a boardroom in a business sense doesn't necessarily apply when we're talking about academicians and scientists working from either at the bench or at the bedside. And so therein began this sort of pursuit of mine of, gosh, what is it that brings together a set of researchers who have specialized in various aspects of human health together to answer really complex or interesting clinical problems. And so, I do work with Insights. We bring together about 500 people per year interested in how to help team more effectively. You can see that at the ICTS at UC Irvine, I do tons of consultations from individual leadership development all the way up to center support at the university, and then also providing just general guidance. If you go to this tsal.uci.edu, you'll see comprehensive guidance on how to team more effectively. I will say that I do think that we're all coming from really different spaces as we think about teams. Some of us are doing work in a basic disciplinary fashion, and that's okay, but you're still working with others who, again, are maybe they're undergraduates, postdocs, maybe you're collaborating with one other investigator, a couple other people in your field in a similar area. And I'm going to argue that the technical scientific skills that you've been given are great, but insufficient to get to excellence. And what we often see is this lack of ability in terms of maybe different domains like project management or mentorship or program project tracking over time. And we're going to talk conflict management, communication. They're very sort of soft skills that I think really make the difference as we see people's careers progress. And so we'll talk about that in more depth. So one important aspect here is I want to say that, some of these grand challenges that I mentioned before, we find that to answer these questions, it means that we've got to come together across our areas of expertise, integrate what we know, and therein lies solutions that we are seeking. And so this assumption, though, is that we need diversity in terms of cognitive perspectives. We need our various lived experiences to come into play as we think about maybe behavioral challenges or various interventions that we're developing. And again, we're going to find the answers, right, to these questions by coming together. These examples that I provide here are sorts of projects and programs that I've been able to collaborate with others on. And I mentioned Kawasaki's disease in particular as part of the what we call UC BRAID, which is a UC University of California consortium. If you think about Kawasaki's disease as a pediatrician, you're likely to see only a handful of these cases in a given year. And only by partnering with others are you going to get the population size, the data you need to really make any meaningful traction on that seemingly intractable problem about what is Kawasaki's disease and how can you effectively treat children suffering from this ailment. So in 2015, the National Academies of Science put forth a report on team science. It, to date, from what I understand, is the most downloaded report from the National Academies of Science history. And in this report, it outlined the biggest challenges that we face when we decide to engage in team science, right?
And, you know, there were a number, all of these were mentioned, right? That we have this diversity of membership, we have large team sizes, we're bringing together individuals who may or may not have the exact same career goals or scientific goals at hand. And our teams are changing as the, you know, disease manifests and evolves over time. And there's a great deal of interdependence, right? Our animal models need to match our clinical samples, and our pathology needs to feed into other parts of the lab, etc. And so this high level of interdependence and what it is that we're working on also creates a great amount of, you know, sort of burden, right? As this team says, gosh, we want to do this important work, but it isn't easy to actually do. There in Georgia, you guys might be teaming with various institutions in the state to regionally, you know, tackle problems that are important, or you might be working with collaborators from your graduate institution. Add on to all of these different diversity components and say, gosh, what if we're not even co-located? And for sure, we would say that the technology of Zoom and other, whether it's Teams or Slack, right, we've been able to close the gap a little bit, but we're still finding that teaming virtually is a barrier or a challenge. So when we think about, well, what does it take? You know, so let me step back here and say the scientific career, even if you went into biology or whatever it might have been because you sort of wanted to work independently, we're going to break that assumption down and say, gosh, you know what? To answer important questions, we're going to have to work with others. Not only that, if we want to get to more impactful work as we go from assistant to associate to full, we're going to have to keep working across areas, bringing in different tools and frameworks to our work, getting to the place where we're submitting multiple PI grants, starting to apply for center funding, right? And that takes something different than technical or scientific knowledge. And I argue that it takes team scientific leadership skills, right? And this is going to mean saying, gosh, I know how to do the science, but I can also create a scientific vision. I can also staff together important teams that are able to do the work. I can develop and train them over time. I can manage multiple projects simultaneously. And at the same time, make sure that everyone is working towards the values of quality, ethical management of data, et cetera, et cetera. So if we pause and you go, gosh, if you think back to your, you know, your graduate education, your postgraduate education, and you say to yourself, well, did I take a class on leadership? Did I take a class on organizational development or team leadership? Right? And we go, oh no, right? Here's a sort of paucity of skills, right? And so, you know, I first want to make a plug, right? That if there with the CTSA and with Chris Weiss, there are opportunities like mentioned prior to build these teaming capabilities, you know, I think that's right there with making sure you got the statistical tools you needed to do your work in your field, as this is going to be quite important. And I encourage, as you're listening to me talk, if anybody has any questions or anything they want to put into the chat, you should feel free to do so. Okay. All right. So I mentioned before that, you know, what is team science? I think you've had a couple of talks before, so I won't belabor the point. But team science includes anytime we're bringing together various individuals to work on a common phenomenon. It can be done within a particular discipline, but usually when we refer to team science or more, the more recent term is convergent science, we're thinking about bringing together a group of people to work where individuals on that team represent different fields, frameworks, tools, etc. And we do so to, you know, answer our complex questions. And so again, I want to state we're moving away from this notion of the solo scientist working alone to a collaborative research endeavor. Now, I will say that I'm very, very aware that our our academic institutions send us mixed messages, right? There's sort of the, hey, we want you to team, we want you to collaborate, we want to see interdisciplinary efforts. Yet when you're asked to do your P&T, your promotion and tenure paperwork, everything on that progress performance evaluation paperwork says, what have you done in the last year or two? What have you done over the course of your career? And I do want to highlight, right, the value of being a part of a team and still being able to justify your individual contribution. In essence, why that team wouldn't be where they are if you weren't there as a vital team member, right? So making sure that narrative of independence within the collective is still alive and well. So again, across all fields, we're seeing an uptick in collaboration in teams. I think the only fields where we're not seeing as much team science are the humanities and the arts, where, you know, writing a book, painting a painting, you know, there's still more individual practices. We can definitely say that some of why we team is because what we've done in our graduate studies is to get to know one particular type of cell really, really well, or one particular organ particularly well. And in becoming so specialized, it can sometimes be difficult to connect that specialized knowledge to the specialized knowledge of someone else. And, you know, I borrow this slide from a colleague here who says, gosh, look, you know, in 1903, the Wright brothers could put together a plane, 2 people, generalist skills. Fast forward to 2013, and it takes 31 specialists to build the Dreamliner. And I would say we're in a similar space in the academic side of academic medicine, and that we are all so narrowly specialized. Coming together to work creates this growing burden to figure out, well, how do we actually do that successfully? Oops. And now the data here suggests that it's actually something that we say we can do quite well, but it's quite challenging. Here's an example right here as a study done by Cummings and Kiesler, where they took 500 NSF funded teams who all said that they were going to work across, you know, disciplines and fields and answer an important question. And what their data says is that those teams that had more disciplines represented and more universities had fewer patents, publications, and other knowledge outcomes than when the work was done from a single discipline or from, you know, fewer schools, which, you know, you might think about, well, you know, what is that about? And in your mind, you're probably saying, oh gosh, it's because the, you know, different fields, their data don't speak to one another, or we use language in one field that another field doesn't quite get, or perhaps levels of analysis complicate how different collaborators work together. And those of you who do multi-site research clearly get the challenges that come from subawards and finding times to meet and blind spots as you're trying to understand what is happening in your lab, exactly what's happening in another lab. So surprise, surprise, we're not so good at this. I would even say that, let me pause here. I would even say that if you reflect on the last grant that you were a part of, a very common experience, right? I'll just let you think for a minute about the last one that you submitted with someone else, or maybe, you know, you were the lead on it. But often the common narrative goes like this. Hey, the grant is due December 15th, right? I think we can all do this opioid research. And the lead person emails a couple of colleagues and says, hey, you've been doing this work in opioid research, or you've been working in the psychology clinic looking at addiction, and various people are brought around, and the PI says, it's due in a couple of weeks. Send me your narrative, send me a couple paragraphs, forward me your bio sketch, and I'll pull it together, right? And then a grant proposal gets developed, and maybe there's a request for your CPS and then changes to your, you know, documents or something, right? And your current and pending support, and the grant goes in, right? And no one really knows exactly how much they were written in for or what their role was exactly. Maybe you read it a little bit ahead of time, but it's often this quick and loosely defined exercise. And so you can imagine, especially when that's the formative process for a grant proposal, that when the grant is funded and it's going, oh gosh, we were, our 4 labs are supposed to work together on this work, or our lab in this clinic, and it's time to actually get the work done, that there wasn't necessarily the conversation around who's going to do what, when is that going to happen, who's in charge of these particular components. And so integration is something that's lacking from the very, very beginning. In fact, as many of you know, the money will come in despite having promised that everybody was going to work together in this really integrated way. Different investigators go to their respective labs, do their work, and when the progress report is due, there might be a sort of update like, oh yeah, send me what your lab has done, send me what your group has done, and I'll, again, pull a story together. But that's not really the interdisciplinary or cross-domain work that's going to get us closer to important solutions, right? So we want to be cautious around the ways we engage in our formative processes. So I'm going to use that. So I want to use that here to motivate this. And Jennifer King is saying administrators have a lot of the skill sets.
Till you're done. I'm just putting my questions as they're coming to my mind.
Yeah. And this is really important because administrators, as they're pulling the grant together, they're going to be able to help a great deal. And I'll discuss that also throughout. So here's what I want to make. I'm going to give you the punchline a little bit ahead of time. Right. So we are talking about bringing together collaborations that are asking complex questions, right? Even if we take the COVID-19 challenge, right? We have this virus that we thought had one form, taking on multiple forms over time. And we're saying, what's the team that we need to pull together to engage in this work that is uncertain, that is ambiguous, and that is constantly changing. And so this question of, well, how do we structure a team if we don't even know all aspects of the work we're going to do a priori? And so, I think about this and I say, gosh, if we have discovery medical research teams that are working on these problems, what does planning mean when it isn't even clear that our first pilot study is going to work the way we want, or our second pilot study, and that we're going to that more information about the phenomenon we're looking at is going to be revealed over time? And so without perfect information about the work ahead, how do you correctly staff that scientific team, right? Bring together the right investigators and develop a plan of action? And what might help to aid this process a little bit more? And so again, as a professor of management, I say, gosh, how can we learn more from the business side? And so I looked first to entrepreneurial groups, right? These are startups. And I say, gosh, how do they develop a plan when the market might be uncertain, the demand for their products might be unclear, and there might be just changing competitive landscapes all at the same time, right? I also asked the question, how can firms who are trying to anticipate what's coming next engage in corporate strategic planning without perfect information? And then lastly, there is some work on how groups integrate different pieces of information on complex problems. And I took these literatures and started to inform this question around, can and how does planning happen when it's provisional, tentative, because the task is unclear, or when the solution is not exactly as simple as a lock and key kind of problem? And so what we did is to develop this exercise, right? And this again is coming, I'm going to stop and say this is inspired, right, by all those observations of the medical research teams at the Langone Medical Center at NYU, where I would see early phases of work where more successful teams took the time to engage in preliminary conversation. And in essence, they would develop what you might call a draft prototype or exploratory activities, e.g., tiny pilot studies to try to figure out what is it that that we are asking, how is the phenomena that we're looking at, how exactly does it work? And in allowing for that space of, before we concretely say this is what we're going to do, we're going to, in essence, elicit as many different viewpoints and potential core activities we could engage in, and then begin to scaffold together what might be a research project with a couple of different aims and a couple of different activities. But this early coming together to say, what might we do? I argued in this study that this can be really important in terms of getting to better knowledge integration and better productivity for early research teams. And as I share with you the design, I'm going to compare half of my sample that's going to engage in this provisional planning activity and half of a sample where I don't intervene at all, right? I let it follow the description I gave you guys earlier of how, grants come together and project teams come together. So the reason I think that this intervention of provisional planning is going to work, stopping, right, to come together and plan, is because in this discussion of what might be a viable treatment, therapy, intervention that we could do, you start to learn a little more about investigators who come together around the table that you might not have known prior to this work, right? And so as you are hearing, right, that your colleague has this methodology or that they have a prior finding from their last experiment, we begin to uncover who knows what and how our information connects to theirs and how their information connects to a colleague's. And we begin to say, these are the pieces that we're able to play with as we, again, tackle this challenging research question. So again, I'm going to say, if we stop and engage in this interim problem solving or provisional planning, we will see greater knowledge integration through a better understanding of what our fellow teammates know. Not only that, as we start to brainstorm and come up with these smaller aims and pilot projects, we'll realize, oh gosh, this is a viable path for our research. This is something we could really do. This is what colleagues Ree, Goldenbiddle, and German call small wins. And with the establishment of tiny short-term activities that are successful, this group can also, the early stage research teams, especially when team members haven't worked together, can begin to develop a sense of creative confidence. Like, oh wow, like this is something that might have some potential. I mentioned my interest in not just looking at corporate executives and being really interested in academics. One factor that's really unique to us is that we get to choose which projects we want to work on and which projects we just say, nope, I don't have time for that. When you come into a new interdisciplinary team, as many of you on the call know, it takes forever to figure out what is it we're really going to be able to do. Often you join these groups and you end up walking away saying, I met a person, I met, interesting conversation, but this is still so far gone and I don't know when this is actually going to become a paper or a project. I think I'll just skip the next meeting. But what happens here with this provisional planning exercise is, again, people are learning what everybody knows, and they're actually concretely starting to define small wins or short-term aims. And lastly, in thinking carefully about the particular projects aim 1, aim 2, aim 3, small project, small win here and there. We're going to go from knowing who knows what, thinking about what the team can do together, to actually getting to a planning project phase, where it might be that you're saying, okay, look, investigator 1 is going to gather data, let's say it's a team looking at pediatric nutrition or obesity. It might be that you say, okay, look, so-and-so is going to gather behavioral data. The engineer is going to gather the wearable information. We're going to have the geneticist look at epigenetics and why weight gain is happening here instead of there. But you might start to piece together how everyone's different frameworks and data are going to sync and get closer to synergy. And so again, we say, well, why would this small planning intervention lead to better outcomes? Again, we're getting to better understanding of who knows what, a better sense of our potential, and even the preliminary markings of, and this is how we're actually going to do our work together, because we know how our knowledge and our work processes fit together. And here's a picture for you to see what it is that I proposed in this particular study. Any questions so far as I get to the sample? Okay. All right. So the participants in this study actually come from CTSAs all over the country, all research ones. So these teams tended to be not even just West Coast centric, really all over. And they were often coming together in either applying for seed funding from their organization, or getting ready to submit something to NIH, NCI, and they all had to be answering a particular research question. But one condition of participation is that they could not have worked together for more than 6 months. So we really wanted teams that were what we would call nascent. We did not want research teams that had been, working together for a decade. We wanted newly formed teams, and we wanted to be sure that they were going to submit for funding. They had a plan, at least, to submit for funding within the next calendar year. And so we started by giving both arms of the study a baseline survey that asked about their knowledge of one another, their research interests, a couple of the baseline measures that I'll explain in a little bit. Then we took randomly selected teams from across these CTSAs, and we said, look, we want you to come in for this 1.5 hours intervention, and we called it a scaffolding or planning intervention. And then we tracked down every team member from 3 months to about 6 months. Sometimes it took a little while to get the data that we needed or the responses that we needed. And then we asked the PI or lead investigators to give us some update in terms of performance outcomes, right? This was, what had they been submitting, where were they in terms of funding, etc. And so here's a picture of one team. This was a community engaged research group beginning to do this exercise. And, for those of you on the call who are actively drawing together teams and starting to bring to life your own personal scientific vision for your career, this exercise starts with bringing individuals into a physical room together. They're all given this really large Post-it sheet and then several other smaller Post-its. And we started with asking everybody to say, gosh, what is the overarching aim of this work? In essence, why are we here in the room together? And then to ask them each to say, to answer this question, once they settled on a shared aim, who are the people, right? And not necessarily by name, but what are the basis of expertise that need to be represented in this team for us to be able to get this work done? We asked them to think about, 2 to 3 sub projects that they felt would move them towards the accomplishment of their overarching aim. Following that, we said, okay, take all those different expertise areas that you outlined prior and populate each of those aims with the right individuals that should be working on aim 1, aim 2, aim 3. So as an example, if someone says we're going to develop a diagnostic tool, then we were putting evaluation individuals, we were putting clinical care providers, right? We were thinking about who needs to be there to do that assessment. If it was animal model work, very different staffing of those kinds of projects. And finally, we said, okay, look, you've got aim 1, you've got aim 2, you've got aim 3, but they need to be synergistic. Who and how are you going to make sure that there are cross linkages so that you have an entire program project of work? And so in this hour and a half, investigators are quite engaged in mapping out their joint work. And what I would say comes from prior teams research is a bit of a semi-structure around giving teams a process to go through to design out their scientific work. And again, the preface, this is provisional. We're brainstorming, we're playing, right? Go ahead and think, outside of the box about what this team could do together. Any thoughts for those of you on the call about which aspects of the work might have been most challenging for these teams, or where they might have spent most time engaged in dialogue? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Can we just mention it out loud?
Say that again?
You want us to just say it out loud?
Yes, please.
I'm thinking they may have had some dialogue around who's the best person to assign the work to, because they may all approach a topic like you mentioned. I don't know if you mentioned pain, you mentioned opioids. They could all approach opioids from some different nuanced way, but whose way is the best way for whatever the project is that we're working on?
Right. So this is a really great point. I'll give you an example, right? I had one team that was looking at cancer survivorship, and cancer survivorship meant something very different to a fertility specialist than it meant to a psychiatrist, than it meant to a primary health provider. And so one question becomes, well, what is our aim here, given that we all see, like they say, the proverbial elephant from all of our different perspectives? And then whose expertise matters the most, right? Depending on the work. And what I would say, and I'm not sure who, might have been Emily who was sharing her perspective. I'm not certain.
That was Jennifer.
Jennifer. So what it might be is we say, let's say program aim 1 with the opioid research is to build an animal model and to look at behavioral characteristics or traits of an addicted animal, mouse, rat. Then the expertise for that project looks really different than if we were looking at, opioid and brain health, right? And so dependent on where the group defined their work, the staffing shifted. I had one team, guys, at UCLA who did this exercise. They had submitted a grant, not received a high score, and they said to me, Dr. Salazar, had we done this exercise first, we probably would be funded, because we failed to recognize that we didn't have, I forget what the person was, but it was, whether it was a nurse, clinical care, some role that they just failed to include. And so NIH is essentially saying to you, are you good for the $500,000 we're going to give you? Have you thought through the management and the staffing and the coordination critical for your work? And this planning process highlights for everyone, what are we doing? Who needs to be here? What tools do we need access to in order to conduct our work, such that we can say we are well equipped well-resourced, and ready to go, right? Failing to engage in this exercise, as I'll show you with the data, creates suboptimal outcomes. So, we asked them some self-report, hey guys, if you were across these both control and experiment, did you feel like there was combination of sharing of ideas across team members? Did you think that somebody else's original idea got combined with other people's ideas in the team? How much synergy occurred, right? We also asked for more objective outcomes, like how many publications, how much funding, how many grant submissions has this team engaged in post this exercise. We measured those psychological processes that I mentioned to you before, understanding knows who knows what, team creative efficacy, and then enhanced coordination among members. These are the means, standard deviations, and correlations for the various measures. Again, cross-sectional, randomly assigned data. Here are our findings. It was absolutely the case that those teams who engaged in that 1.5-hour intervention did better on those knowledge integration outcomes, both subjective and objective, than their counterparts. What's curious is that everybody in the scaffolding intervention did learn more about what everybody else knew. They did go, oh gosh, this team might have something here. We might be able to do some important scientific work. And they also got a sense of how work could be accomplished together as a group through the exercise I just mentioned previously. The only factor that was the predictor of knowledge integration was this understanding of how their various knowledge linked together to produce, a project. And this is a significant full mediation here. If we look at just those objective outcomes of performance, you can see the comparison condition. They have it is significantly different, but they have a slightly different lower level of knowledge integration. They both submitted internal submissions to their, academic school about the same, but take a look at their rate of external submissions, right? To me, this data suggests that our intervention essentially fast-tracked, catalyzed this team's ability to come together and figure out what they could do sooner. Their publications, similar patterns where we're seeing a significant uptick, and the impact factors greater through engaging in this process. So what does that mean? What this means is that we've got to put planning back on the agenda. I know that everyone is super busy with mentoring, the different talks going on campus, the job searches occurring, and we're running our labs, etc. But I want to highlight the value of engaging in 1 to 2 hour blocks within our labs, new teams, etc., to just really think about developing, framing, provisionally planning our next grant submission. If you're interested in this exercise and the specific steps, I'm happy to share it with you, or even to run it on, for some of you if interested. But when we figure out what we're doing, who's doing what, why we're doing it, and how we're going to do it together, what happens is that everybody has a clear picture, and we're going, yes, I'm on board. I know that you're going to expect this from me. It's on my calendar. Everyone feels like their talents and expertise is being utilized efficiently. They're loving that they never thought to use machine learning on their cell data in that way, and it's super exciting. We're identifying what we know. We're going, oh gosh, we invited these people to the meeting, but we did not invite a pharmacist, or we didn't invite a radiologist. You really see the gaps in who should be at the table and isn't. And you're able to say, gosh, rather than break down mid-project, we're going to anticipate beforehand how the work, the various project work and activities can better sync together a priori, therefore reducing some real losses in coordination. I want to show you, for those of you that are getting ready to submit a grant, how that exercise translates into various visuals that your program officer or what's the word I'm looking for? The peer review at NIH. I can't remember the name that it's called right now. But when your grant is being reviewed, providing a visual and verbiage that says, we've really study section. Thank you so much, Julie, for really providing a visual to your federal agency that says, hey, we didn't just toss biosketches your way, give you paragraphs chunked up like the geneticist will do this, the biologist will do this, the radiologist will do this, and we're all going to work together by having meetings once a month. Instead, you're showcasing how particular projects, and TRP means Translational Project 1, Translational Project 2, you're basically going to say, gosh, Translational Research Project 1 is going to go from basic to clinical, and you know what? It's going to intersect with these various functions, right? And this is just one example of a kind of project, but any way that you can say, we're connecting people, resources, and expertise, and we're going to show you how they're going to intersect and work meaningfully. And you can even talk about the plan for integration along the way. So, theoretically, right, as a management scholar, a lot of times when you talk about like knowledge integration, synergy, and cognitive work, we take what individuals know as puzzle pieces that are just intended to be put together, and it's already clear what the puzzle is, how many pieces are in the puzzle, and everybody has one. But as you guys know, the medical research scientific endeavor is full of question marks. Biology fundamentally is unstable, right? It's always changing, it's always in flux. And what I propose is that if the work we're doing is fluid, flexible, and adaptable, then our teaming processes and the ways we form our teams and they evolve over time has to match that as well. And so we provided this formal intervention. It works. And I want to, again, highlight that in your practice, the value of pausing, planning, even if it's provisional, and that such an activity can really increase your trajectory for scientific progress and performance. So I think we have a couple of minutes left here, about 10 minutes, but I want to again highlight, some of the various the T-cell resources, if you're interested. Again, we've provided data and important sites and exercises for various team leaders. You cannot schedule a one-on-one consultation. That's something I offer at UCI, but I did want to highlight that I'm sure this consultation also occurs there at Georgia, maybe with Dr. Weiss or others. And if you're interested in connecting with me to gain resources or to continue to learn about the work that I do related to scientific teams, I would be happy to do so. In particular, I'll be going back to the National Academies in December as they're interested in reflecting on how COVID has changed the way we're doing scientific research across the country. And so that'll be an ongoing area of investigation or work. Any questions or any responses to anything that I shared this afternoon?
So this is Jennifer again. This is just wonderful. I put a couple of questions in the chat earlier, so if you could address those, that'd be great.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's look at the first one about administrators and the skill sets needed for team science. So the first I'll say is that there are particular conditions, again, at an institutional level that are really enabling to bring teams together. The first is the provision of the seed funding mechanisms, right? So it could be, if you haven't looked recently, that your CTSA has various seed fund awards. It could be that your cancer, I don't know if there's a cancer center there. It could be that your vice chancellor for research also has various opportunities for funding. Those seed mechanisms are opportunities, as you know, to gather preliminary data. The preliminary data will be essential for ongoing funding. It also gives you a reason to submit, to email colleagues, again, in computer science, in biology, in wherever it might be, to think about how you might work together and begin a conversation, right? So I want to say that. The second is that, you know, the CTSA and various research development officers can be a resource in that if they know what you do, they're more likely to send you new calls for proposals from the Army Research Office, from NIH, NCI, and connect you to potential opportunities. And I want to highlight again the value of the either, you know, obviously we know you should get biostatistical support, evaluation support if you're doing a particular big project and need a non-biased assessment of how your intervention is working. And then lastly, your team science experts on campus. You know, on my campus, we have done a great deal at UC Irvine to raise awareness around what team science is. And at this point, I have several, oh gosh, I think I'm working with 3 or 4 different chairs of departments who are looking to get ongoing leadership support, thinking about how to better design and facilitate interaction within their departments. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are a number of junior investigators that are saying to me, look, have to go from working on my research to beginning to look up and build collaborations so that I can get the next level of funding. How do I develop those collaborative networks? How do I get in those conversations, et cetera, right? So I think this notion of ongoing professional development and getting connected to administrators and coaches, team science training personnel, I don't think we can ignore it anymore. It is, you know, and I'll stop again. Each of you, think about the most productive scientist you know that's constantly got funding, that's running, you know, a significantly sized labs, constant communication with POs about next trends. And I'll ask you, aren't they a fantastic leader, mentor, program manager, right? They figured out that the science is sufficient, but it will be this ability to manage and lead that helps them to transcend their colleagues who don't invest in as much in the collaborative skills necessary to build their research endeavors. Good. Let's see. Jennifer, do you have additional questions, or was that any other follow-ups based on my response?
Yeah, I do have a follow-up, but I don't want to like monopolize the whole conversation. So if somebody else has a question, I can't wait.
This is Twee. I really appreciate the research that you're doing and to be able to demonstrate those results, because I know when we're coaching managers and administrators, everyone's going to say, we don't have time to do this preparatory work, right? To be able to pull these pieces together and these various parts of the teams. And so it's going to be critical to continue to demonstrate the value, and your research really shows that in very concrete terms to justify that initial investment.
Right. And yeah, I mean, that's part of why I do it, but I don't know if Steve is still on the call as well. He might not be. But, you know, so I've been working with a number of these in ERCs, right, which are large engineering grants. And increasingly, right, they're asking for a statement of how are the PIs going to work together if it's a multiple PI mechanism. They're wanting to know how are sites going to collaborate, what plans will be in place for the development of junior talent, especially women and minorities. And all three of those significant criteria that the study section are looking at suggests that this planning work is right there with the science for determining merit. Often what we do with the Team Science Acceleration Lab and the Team Science Directing work at UC Irvine is that will often be written into grants at around 1%, I suppose, with the explicit language, right? So-and-so will serve as the team science advisor on this initiative. They'll help with kickoffs. They'll do interim check-ins with the principal investigators and will help in the case that challenges arise in the collaboration. And so I think making sure that partnership is there is very much, again, since I joined UCI, the Vice Chancellor for Research, we didn't have any federally funded centers. We're now at, I believe, 500 million annually with numerous centers. And part of it is because of the team science work to increase the viability of those seed funding projects over time and to fine tune where needed. And I know, Twee, I'm probably speaking to the choir to you, but I want to just raise awareness around how team science can actually be a source of competitive advantage and should be included in the research proposals and allocated, at least sometime, even if it's one-on-one with the PI for planning and progress tracking.
Absolutely agree with you.
Good. Anything else that I can help anyone with, or any reactions to the research? All right, so my very last comment here is that, I am seeing an increase in executive coaching among scientists. And I will suggest that you've already invested this many years in your education, that if those of you who are finding yourself mid-career to senior leadership, whether in your, in labs or in departments, on your way to chair, deans, et cetera, that it's never a bad idea to seek out that one-on-one leadership development, as it will help you and it'll obviously advance science that we, finding answers that we sorely need as a society. So just continue to invest in your own abilities and develop yourself as a leader in science. Good. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Oh, thank you. If anybody wants to chat a little bit here, I'm happy to stay on for a bit.
So yeah, because I joined late, so I was wondering what your background was.
I'm a professor at the business school. I have a PhD in management, but I also have a master's in social work.
I noticed that. So how are you blending? That helps you blend it well, huh?
I think some of the same challenges we see working in, whether it's power, assertiveness, confidence, communicating authentically who you are. So many of those same challenges come in to how we facilitate meetings and connect with others in the workplace. So, like, for example, I recently was working with a woman who's really, really quite skilled and talented at UC Irvine. And she says, I'm really fatigued and I'm angry a lot. And I keep kind of snapping at my research coordinator and so we talked about, those feelings of anger and aggression, especially when we're tired, like that's a real part of managing yourself as a leader. Ended up making a referral, right, to go, for an EAP, because I think there might have been some other challenges going on. But I think to think that all of a sudden we take off the rest of our life and then we go lead our scientific projects, that's just not reality.
Right.
And I think especially on the heels of the COVID pandemic, we are so tired. and we are just easing back in. And we haven't taken the opportunities to check in to say, am I leading from a space that I want to be leading from? Or am I just, crossing off my to-dos and powering through? But when you have a lab of colleagues looking at you for inspiration and productivity, like you've got to be operating from your best self, right? But those are the small ways where the social work degree comes in thinking about how to help people be their best at work.
Nice.
That's such an on-point conversation. When I found doing coaching with our healthcare organization executives, that's been the similar theme, right? Because there's this expectation that we focus on the work, and a lot of times staying so focused on the work, we're either not aware of, or things are just moving too fast, and we're finding ourselves engaging in these types of behaviors that end up isolating or creating additional challenges for the team communication.
Yeah, that's right. So that's where, I always say now in this age of like, if you're leading a virtual team, especially, it's less so. But, I think a check-in is more important than ever. And, the data conducted by Google about, if they always hire elite talent, why were some teams performing better? And it ended up being leaders who individuated and really connected to employees beyond, hey, did you finish this? Where's this paper I needed, et cetera, to, how are you? What do you need? Where are you at in your, space today? And what do you need?
For me.
Plus, I want to engage as a partner, right? Similarly, I've done some work with Price Waterhouse where they looked at, who's most likely to make it to partner. And it tends to be the individuals who are the best developers of the talent who reports to them. Not surprisingly, if you think about labs who make sure every single person's they're learning how to write, they're learning how to look at data, they're learning how to do clinical work, and they rise up in their career. Well, guess what? You're going to see higher productivity of the lab as a whole, right? And you're going to see gains. So it's often the case too, people think leadership is, giving direction, but it's also being a consistent teacher. And learning how to do that while managing the workload is a balancing act. So those are all sort of themes, right, around the scientific career. Yeah, but that's right. Helping leaders be the coach also is critical.